After a devastating storm, a lonely man named Will Garrett, haunted by the loss of his family, rescues two injured dogs, Buck, a brave shepherd, and Daisy, timid beagle. The dog's arrival transforms Will's life, breaking through his isolation and reigniting his sense of purpose. As Will uncovers a sinister dogfighting ring tied to their past, he risks everything to ensure justice is served. Through resilience and love, Buck and Daisy not only heal from their trauma, but also inspire Will to rebuild his life and help others. Together, they become a symbol of second chances, proving that even in the darkest times, hope can shine through. What did you think about this heartwarming story of love, courage, and redemption? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more compelling tales of resilience and hope. The wind howled through the dense forest, a relentless, icy force that whipped at the bare trees and blanketed the ground in snow. The storm showed no mercy, burying everything in its path under an unforgiving sheet of white. Through the chaos, two figures struggled forward. Buck, a large shepherd dog with a matted, blood-streaked coat, forged ahead with grim determination. Behind him, Daisy, a frail beagle, stumbled and lagged, her tiny legs trembling with exhaustion. Each step seemed to cost her more than the last, her paws raw and bleeding from the cold, unforgiving terrain. Buck glanced back, his golden eyes scanning Daisy's weakened form. He paused briefly, nudging her with his nose, his breath steaming in the frozen air. She looked up at him, her wide brown eyes filled with trust and despair. The storm intensified, snow swirling in blinding flurries, but Buck pressed on. He had to. Stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant death. A memory flickered in Buck's mind. Chains, a dark shed, the sound of cruel laughter. The pain in his legs was nothing compared to the terror of that place. He had broken free, snapping the rusty chain that bound him. But he hadn't left alone. He had pulled Daisy from her tether, her tiny cries spurring him on even as his own strength waned. Now, as the wind tore at them, Buck's instincts screamed to find shelter. The faint scent of pine and earth under the snow gave him hope. He sniffed the air and turned toward a faint shadow in the distance. A towering oak tree, its roots partially exposed and forming a shallow hollow. With a low growl, Buck nudged Daisy toward the tree. She stumbled but managed to follow, collapsing into the hollow as soon as they reached it. Buck curled his larger body around hers, his thick fur providing what little warmth he could muster. The hours crawled by, the storm raging around them. Buck remained alert, his ears twitching at every sound, his body trembling as the cold seeped into his bones. Daisy's breathing was shallow, her tiny body shivering under his protective embrace. As dawn broke, a faint scent carried on the wind, smoke. Buck's nose twitched. Smoke meant fire, warmth, and people. It also meant danger. Buck hesitated. His scars, both visible and hidden, reminded him of what humans could do. But Daisy's soft whimper was enough to silence his doubts. She wouldn't last another night in the cold. With one last glance at her fragile form, Buck rose to his feet. Snow clung to his fur as he stepped out into the bitter morning light. The scent of smoke was stronger now, guiding him through the blinding white expanse. In the distance, the faint outline of a cabin emerged, a thin trail of smoke curling from its chimney. Buck stopped, his body tense with uncertainty. He sniffed the air again, his instincts warring with his need to protect Daisy. Taking a deep breath, he pushed forward. The porch creaked under his weight as he reached the door. Summoning his remaining strength, he let out a low, desperate bark. Inside the cabin, Will Garrett sat alone, staring into the flickering flames of his fireplace. His rugged hands rested on his knees, his face etched with lines of sorrow. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil in his heart, a heart hollowed by loss. The bark broke through the monotony of the wind, drawing Will's attention. He frowned, his head turning toward the door. Another bark, soft but insistent, echoed through the storm. Rising from his chair, Will grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously to the door. Living in isolation had taught him to be wary, but as he opened the door, the sight before him stole his breath. A shepherd stood on the porch, his body trembling with exhaustion. Frost clung to its matted coat, and its ribs jutted sharply against its skin. His deep golden eyes met Will's, silently pleading for help. "Oh my God," Will whispered. He swung the door open wider as the dog took a shaky step forward before collapsing at his feet. Will knelt down, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he reached for the dog. His breath came in shallow, labored bursts, and its body was far too light for its size. The golden eyes stared at him, filled with exhaustion and something else, trust. "I've got you," Will murmured, his voice unsteady. Carefully, he scooped the shepherd into his arms, surprised at how limp it felt. Closing the door with his foot, he carried the dog toward the fireplace, its warmth spreading into the cold, lifeless room. Will laid the dog down on a thick rug near the hearth, his movements deliberate and gentle. Grabbing a blanket from the couch, he draped it over the trembling creature. It didn't resist, only shifting slightly under the sudden weight of warmth. "Hang in there," Will said, more to himself than the dog. Turning quickly to the kitchen, he fetched a bowl of lukewarm water. As he knelt beside the shepherd, he noticed scars crisscrossing its shoulders and sides. Some were old and faded, while others were raw and angry-looking. His jaw tightened as he soaked a clean cloth and began wiping away the frost and dirt clinging to its fur. "What the hell happened to you?" he muttered under his breath. The dog flinched slightly but didn't pull away. He simply lay there, his chest rising and falling weakly. As Will worked, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft whimper, almost imperceptible over the crackle of the fire. He froze, straining to hear. Came again. From near the door, Will stood, his muscles tense. Grabbing his flashlight, he moved to the door and cracked it open. The icy wind bit into his face, but he ignored it, sweeping the light over the snow-covered porch. Then he saw it. A smaller dog, a beagle, lay just beyond the porch steps, his tiny body half buried in the snow. "Jesus," Will gasped, stepping outside. He reached down, scooping up the trembling creature with one arm and pulling it against his chest. The beagle didn't even lift its head, its breath shallow and faint. "Two of you," he murmured as he carried the smaller dog inside. "What's going on here?" Will set the beagle down beside the shepherd, quickly wrapping it in another blanket. This one was in worse shape, its fur matted and patchy, its ribs jutting out painfully. Unlike the shepherd, its eyes remained closed, its body unnervingly still. "Stay with me," Will whispered. He retrieved another bowl of water and a small dropper, carefully dripping a few drops onto the beagle's tongue. Its ears twitched faintly in response, giving him a small glimmer of hope. Over the next few hours, Will tended to the two dogs. The shepherd regained some strength, lifting its head to watch Will as he worked. When he reached out to touch the beagle, the shepherd let out a low, warning growl. "Easy," Will said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm just trying to help." The growl faded, and the shepherd rested its head back on the rug. By morning, the storm had eased, though the world outside was still blanketed in white. Will sat in his worn armchair, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hands. He watched the dogs, now both awake but still weak. "You're a protective one, aren't you?" he said to the shepherd. The dog's ears twitched at his voice, but it didn't look away from the beagle, which was now resting peacefully beside it. Will leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Where'd you two come from?" He didn't expect an answer, but the question lingered in his mind. The scars on the shepherd and the beagle's frailty painted a grim picture. Someone had hurt them badly. As he watched, the shepherd shifted, carefully nudging the beagle closer with its nose. The gesture was almost human in its tenderness. Will sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had planned to take them to the town shelter once the storm cleared, but now he wasn't so sure. There was something about the way the shepherd looked at him, its golden eyes filled with a quiet intelligence, that made him hesitate. "You're not just strays, are you?" he said softly. The shepherd held his gaze for a long moment before resting its head on its paws. As Will cleaned up the blankets and bowls, something caught his eye, a thin, leather collar around the shepherd's neck. He hadn't noticed it before under all the matted fur. Kneeling down, he gently shifted the fur aside, revealing a small, crudely engraved symbol on the collar. It looked like a series of jagged lines and dots, almost like a brand. Will frowned, his instincts prickling. This wasn't a regular collar. The engraving was deliberate, almost sinister. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, tracing the symbol with his finger. The shepherd growled softly, not at Will but at the collar itself, as if it remembered something painful. Will sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He had heard rumors about dogfighting rings and illegal breeding operations in the area, but he had never seen anything like this. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice heavy with anger. The shepherd didn't respond, of course, but its eyes spoke volumes. Later that evening, as the fire crackled softly, the beagle, whom Will decided to call Daisy, lifted her head for the first time. She looked around weakly, her large brown eyes wide with curiosity and fear. "Hey there, little one," Will said gently, kneeling beside her. He offered his hand for her to sniff. Daisy hesitated but eventually rested her nose against his palm. Buck, as Will had decided to name the shepherd, watched closely, his ears twitching with every movement. "You're both tougher than you look," Will said, scratching Buck behind the ears. For the first time, the big dog let out a soft sigh, its body relaxing under Will's touch. As the night deepened, Will sat by the fire with the two dogs curled up beside him. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. The days after the storm brought a tentative sense of routine to Will's cabin. Buck and Daisy slowly recovered under his care. Will fed them small portions of food, carefully watching their progress. Buck, with his protective instincts, always stood between Daisy and the door, his golden eyes scanning for unseen threats. Daisy, though still weak, began to follow Will around the cabin, her tail wagging faintly when he spoke to her. "You're both settling in, huh?" Will said one morning, kneeling to refill their water bowls. Buck nuzzled his hand briefly, a gesture that seemed almost like gratitude. Will couldn't help but smile. It was the first time in years that he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed each morning beyond just going through the motions. A knock on the door one afternoon broke the quiet of the cabin. Buck was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he positioned himself in front of Daisy. "It's okay," Will said, standing and patting Buck's head to reassure him. When he opened the door, Sarah stood on the porch, bundled in a thick coat. She held a basket of supplies in one hand and a concerned expression on her face. "Hey, Will," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Figured you could use some groceries after the storm." Will nodded, gesturing toward the small kitchen. "Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it." As Sarah placed the basket on the counter, her eyes fell on Buck and Daisy. "Where'd they come from?" she asked, her voice softening. "They showed up during the storm," Will replied, leaning against the counter. "Found them half dead out in the snow." Sarah crouched down, reaching a hand toward Daisy. The beagle sniffed her cautiously before licking her fingers. "Poor things," Sarah said, her brow furrowing as she noticed the scars on Buck's body. "They've been through hell." "Yeah," Will muttered, his tone dark, "and I don't think it's over." Sarah straightened, brushing snow off her coat. "I don't mean to scare you, but there's been talk around town. People have seen trucks coming and going from the old Wilson property near the woods. Some think it's tied to that dogfighting ring they busted last year." Will's jaw tightened. He had heard about the Wilson property, a sprawling, abandoned estate that had been a hub for illegal activities before the authorities cracked down. "You think these two came from there?" he asked, glancing at Buck and Daisy. Sarah shrugged. "It's possible. That collar you showed me, it matches some of the descriptions from the reports. If they escaped, someone might come looking for them." Will's eyes darkened as he processed her words. The thought of someone hurting Buck and Daisy again was enough to make his hands clench into fists. "Thanks for letting me know," he said finally, his voice low. Sarah hesitated at the door. "Be careful, Will. If those people are still around, they won't like you meddling." "I'm not planning to meddle," he said, his gaze hard. "But if they come near my dogs, they'll regret it." That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Will sat at the table, staring at the collar he had removed from Buck. The strange symbol etched into the leather seemed to taunt him, a reminder of the darkness these dogs had escaped. Buck lay by the fire, his head resting on his paws but his eyes fixed on Will. Daisy was curled up beside him, her small body pressed against his for warmth. Will sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What am I supposed to do with you two?" he muttered. He knew the logical answer was to take them to the town shelter. Let someone else deal with the fallout. But the thought of handing them over felt wrong, like betraying the trust they had placed in him. Buck lifted his head slightly, as if sensing Will's turmoil. His golden eyes met Will's, calm and unwavering. "You're not making this easy," Will said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Over the next few days, Will found himself growing more attached to Buck and Daisy. Buck followed him everywhere, his large frame a constant, reassuring presence. Daisy, though more timid, began to show signs of playful curiosity, pawing at Will's tools or nudging his hand when she wanted attention. One afternoon, while chopping firewood, Will noticed Buck standing at the edge of the clearing, his ears perked and his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Will called, setting down the axe. Buck didn't move, his gaze fixed on a point deep in the woods. Will walked over, placing a hand on the dog's back. "Something out there?" Buck growled softly, the fur along his spine bristling. Will squinted into the trees but saw nothing unusual. Still, the unease in Buck's posture was enough to put him on edge. "Come on," he said, tugging gently at Buck's collar. "Let's head inside." That evening, as Will prepared dinner, Buck and Daisy suddenly became restless. Buck paced near the door, growling under his breath, while Daisy whimpered softly. "What's gotten into you two?" Will asked, peering out the window. The woods were dark and quiet, but something felt off. A chill ran down Will's spine as he closed the curtains and locked the door. As he sat back down, his gaze fell on the collar still lying on the table. The symbol etched into the leather seemed to glint in the firelight, as though warning him of the storm yet to come. The unease from the previous night lingered as Will prepared breakfast the next morning. Buck and Daisy remained unusually alert, their ears twitching at every small sound outside. "You're both on edge," Will muttered as he set a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. "And now you've got me jumpy too." Buck sat near the door, his gaze fixed on the window. Daisy stayed close to him, her small body pressed against his side. Will couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. After finishing his meal, he grabbed his coat and decided to take a walk through the woods. Buck immediately rose to his feet, his tail stiff. "All right, you can come," Will said, reaching for the leash, but no running off. The snow had started to melt under the weak winter sun, revealing patches of dirt and frozen ground. Will trudged through the woods, the cold biting at his face. Buck walked ahead, his nose close to the ground, sniffing with purpose. They hadn't gone far when Buck suddenly froze, his body tense. He let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on a narrow path that veered off from the main trail. "What is it, boy?" Will asked, following Buck's line of sight. The path was faint, barely visible beneath the snow, but it led deeper into the forest. Will hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, curiosity outweighing caution. The trail ended at a clearing, where an old, dilapidated shed stood hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the wooden walls were dark with rot. Buck growled again, his ears flat against his head. Will approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the icy ground. As he got closer, the stench of decay hit him, sharp and overwhelming. He covered his nose with his sleeve, his stomach churning. The shed's door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Will pushed it open with the toe of his boot, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside, the floor was littered with broken chains, rusted cages, and chewed-up blankets. The walls bore scratch marks, desperate and uneven, as though something had tried to claw its way out. In one corner, a pile of old collars lay discarded, some of them stained dark with dried blood. Will stepped back, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Buck growled again, his body tense as he sniffed the air. Will's gaze fell on a small table near the back of the shed. On it sat a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked and worn. He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and picking it up. The pages were filled with lists, breeds, weights, prices. Will's hands tightened around the notebook as he read the descriptions. Shepherd, strong, obedient, high resale value. "This must be where they came from," he muttered, glancing at Buck. As Will flipped through the pages, a sickening realization settled over him. This wasn't just a shed. It was a prison. The dogs here had been treated as commodities, their lives reduced to numbers on a ledger. Buck let out a sharp bark, snapping Will out of his thoughts. The shepherd's ears were pricked, his body rigid as he stared at the entrance to the shed. Will turned, his flashlight beam landing on a set of fresh footprints in the snow outside. Someone had been here. His heart pounded as he stepped outside, scanning the surrounding forest. The footprints led away from the shed, disappearing into the trees. "We're not alone," he muttered, gripping the notebook tightly. As Will and Buck made their way back to the cabin, the unease in Will's chest grew heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Halfway back, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the trail ahead of them. The man was tall, dressed in a heavy coat with a hood pulled low over his face. He stood still, his posture tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "That belongs to me," the man said, his voice cold and sharp. Will tightened his grip on the notebook. "I don't think so." The man took a step forward. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Leave it here, and no one gets hurt." Buck growled, stepping in front of Will, his teeth bared. The sound was deep and threatening, reverberating through the silent woods. The man hesitated, his eyes darting to Buck. For a moment, fear flickered across his face. "Call off your dog," he demanded, though his voice wavered. Will stood his ground, his gaze hard. "Not a chance." Buck barked sharply, taking a step closer to the man. The stranger flinched, then cursed under his breath. "This isn't over." He spat before turning and disappearing into the trees. When Will and Buck returned to the cabin, Daisy greeted them at the door, her tail wagging nervously. Buck nudged her gently before settling by the fireplace, his body still tense. Will sat at the table, the notebook in front of him. He flipped through its pages again, each entry fueling his anger. "These people need to be stopped," he muttered, his voice low. Buck let out a soft huff, as though in agreement. That night, as the fire crackled softly and the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Will made a decision. He wasn't going to ignore this, whatever danger lay ahead. He owed it to Buck and Daisy, and every dog that had suffered in that shed, to see it through. Will woke early the next morning, his decision from the night before still weighing heavily on his mind. The notebook lay on the table where he had left it, its pages filled with evidence of cruelty and greed. He couldn't just let this go. Buck and Daisy were already awake. Buck lay by the door, his ears twitching at every sound from outside. Daisy rested her head on his paws, her small body pressed close to his for comfort. "You two ready for this?" Will asked, grabbing his coat. Buck let out a low bark, his tail wagging faintly. The path to the shed felt different this time. The sun was brighter, and the snow had started to melt, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. Buck led the way, his nose close to the ground as he followed a faint scent trail. Will carried a small backpack with a camera, hoping to gather more evidence to turn over to the authorities. When they reached the clearing, Will hesitated. The shed loomed ahead. It's dark, rotting walls casting long shadows across the snow. "All right," he muttered, taking a deep breath. "Let's get this done." Inside, the stench was just as overwhelming as before. Will's stomach churned as he stepped over the rusted chains and broken collars scattered across the floor. He took out his camera and began snapping photos. The cages, the scratch marks on the walls, the pile of collars in the corner. Each click of the shutter felt like a small step toward justice. Buck stayed close, his ears perked and his body tense. He sniffed at the collars, letting out a soft growl as though recognizing the scent of something or someone he didn't trust. Will was examining the walls when Buck barked sharply, the sound echoing through the shed. Will spun around, his heart racing. A man stood in the doorway, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hood. "Thought I told you to stay out of this," the man said, stepping inside. Will clenched his fists. "And I thought you'd crawl back into whatever hole you came from." The man chuckled darkly. "You don't know who you're messing with, do you?" Buck growled, positioning himself between Will and the stranger. His fur bristled, and his teeth gleamed in the dim light. The man's eyes flicked to Buck, his smirk faltering. "That dog won't protect you forever." Before Will could respond, the man lunged forward. Buck barked furiously, leaping toward him with surprising speed. The man stumbled back, tripping over a broken chain and falling to the ground. Will didn't hesitate. He grabbed the camera and the notebook, shouting, "Come on, Buck!" Buck barked one last time before following Will out of the shed. They sprinted through the forest, the crunch of snow beneath their feet mingling with the sound of the man's curses behind them. By the time they reached the cabin, Will was out of breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Buck was right behind him, his tongue lolling as he panted heavily. Daisy greeted them with a nervous whine, circling Will as if checking for injuries. "It's okay, girl," Will said, dropping to one knee to pat her head. "We're fine." Buck lay down near the door, his body still tense as he kept watch. Will set the camera and notebook on the table, his hands shaking slightly. He knew the man wouldn't give up easily. That evening, Will called the local sheriff's office. The dispatcher listened intently as he explained everything: the shed, the collars, the notebook, and the man who had confronted him. "We'll send someone out to investigate," the dispatcher assured him. "In the meantime, be careful. If this group is still active, they won't take kindly to interference." Will thanked her and hung up, but the knot in his stomach remained. The next few days passed in an uneasy quiet. Will stayed close to the cabin, keeping a watchful eye on the woods. Buck and Daisy rarely left his side, their presence a constant reminder of why he was doing this. One afternoon, while chopping firewood, Will noticed a car parked at the edge of the forest. It wasn't unusual for hikers or hunters to pass through the area, but something about this car felt off. He squinted, trying to make out the figure inside. The driver's window rolled down slightly, and a flash of something metallic caught the light. A pair of binoculars. Will's grip on the axe tightened. That night, the knock on the door came just as Will was about to go to bed. Buck growled low in his throat, his body stiffening. Daisy whimpered, hiding behind the couch. Will grabbed his flashlight and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. He opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. The man from the shed stood on the porch, his face twisted in a sneer. "Miss me?" Before Will could react, two more men stepped out of the shadows. One of them lunged forward, shoving the door open. Buck barked furiously, launching himself at the nearest attacker. The man yelped as Buck's teeth sank into his arm, but the others rushed inside, forcing Will to the ground. Daisy barked shrilly, darting around the room as chaos erupted. "Where's the notebook?" one of the men shouted, his voice edged with desperation. Will struggled against the weight pinning him down. "You're not getting it," he growled. Buck fought relentlessly, his growls and barks echoing through the cabin. He bit and clawed at the intruders, driving one of them back toward the door. "Damn dog!" one of the men shouted, swinging a flashlight at Buck. The impact sent Buck staggering, but he didn't stop. He lunged again, teeth bared, his body trembling with effort. The sound of sirens cut through the chaos, growing louder with each passing second. The intruders froze, their heads snapping toward the window. "Let's go!" one of them shouted. They retreated, leaving the cabin in disarray. Will knelt beside Buck, his hands trembling as he checked the dog for injuries. Buck was breathing heavily, his body covered in scrapes and bruises, but his tail wagged faintly. "You're a damn hero," Will whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daisy curled up beside Buck, licking his face gently. The sirens grew louder as police cars pulled up to the cabin, their lights flashing in the darkness. Will stood, his gaze hard as he prepared to tell them everything. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the cabin in an eerie glow as police officers stepped out of their vehicles. Their boots crunched in the snow as they approached. Weapons at the ready, Will opened the door, his face grim but steady. Buck lay on the floor beside Daisy, both dogs watching warily as the officers entered. "Mr. Garrett?" one of the officers asked, his flashlight scanning the room. Will nodded. "That's me. They came here looking for this." He placed the leather-bound notebook on the table, its worn cover illuminated by the overhead light. The officer picked it up, flipping through the pages. His expression darkened as he read. "This is more than enough to open a full investigation." As the police examined the evidence, Will knelt beside Buck, gently running his hand along the dog's side. Buck winced but didn't pull away, his golden eyes meeting Will's with quiet resolve. "Is he okay?" one of the officers asked, glancing at Buck. "He'll be fine," Will replied, though his voice betrayed his worry. "He's tougher than he looks." Daisy whined softly, pressing closer to Buck as if to comfort him. One of the officers crouched beside Will. "We'll get a vet out here first thing in the morning. For now, just keep him warm and comfortable." Will nodded, his jaw tight. "Thanks." The following day, a team of officers returned to the shed Will had discovered. They cordoned off the area, documenting every detail: rusted chains, broken cages, and the pile of collars that spoke volumes about the suffering that had taken place there. Will stood at a distance with Buck and Daisy, watching as the officers worked. "This is just the start," one of the investigators said, approaching Will. "We'll need to track down the people responsible, but your evidence gives us a strong lead." Will crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the shed. "Good. They need to pay for what they've done." Word of Will's discovery spread quickly through the small town. People came forward with stories of missing pets and suspicious activity near the Wilson property. Local news stations picked up the story, drawing attention to the illegal operation. Sarah stopped by the cabin one afternoon, carrying a bag of supplies. She knelt down to pet Buck, who wagged his tail weakly. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she said with a smile. Will leaned against the doorframe, his expression softer than usual. "He's more than that. He saved my life." Sarah stood, her eyes meeting Will's. "You saved theirs too. You know, what you did. It's not something many people would have had the courage to do." Will shrugged, but the hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Didn't feel like I had much of a choice." Despite the progress being made, Will couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The memory of the man's sneer, his cold voice warning Will to back off, lingered in his mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a truck pulled up to the edge of the property. Will watched from the window, his fists clenching as two men stepped out, their silhouettes outlined against the fading light. Buck growled low in his throat, his ears flattening as he moved to stand beside Will. "Stay inside," Will told Daisy, patting her head before stepping onto the porch. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice cutting through the cold air. The man from the shed stepped forward, his expression smug. "You've caused us a lot of trouble, old man." Will's jaw tightened. "Good." The man chuckled, but the sound was devoid of humor. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But this ends here." Before Will could respond, the second man lunged forward, his hand reaching for something at his side. Buck reacted instantly, leaping off the porch and barreling into the man with a force that sent him sprawling. The first man cursed, pulling a knife from his jacket, but Will was already moving. Grabbing the axe he had left by the door, Will swung it in a wide arc, forcing the man to backpedal. "Get off my property," Will growled, his voice deadly calm. The sound of sirens cut through the tension, growing louder as police cars sped up the driveway. The men hesitated, their bravado faltering. "You're lucky," Will said, his grip tightening on the axe. "If it were up to me, this wouldn't end with sirens." The men bolted, disappearing into the woods as the police arrived. In the days that followed, the police tracked down and arrested the men connected to the operation. Evidence from the notebook and the shed led to a series of raids, shutting down the illegal network. Will watched the news reports with a mix of relief and anger. It wasn't enough to undo the harm that had been done, but it was a start. With the danger behind them, life at the cabin began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. Buck and Daisy grew stronger each day, their scars fading into memories of a life they had left behind. Will found himself smiling more often, his once empty days now filled with purpose. He spent his mornings chopping firewood, his afternoons working on furniture, and his evenings playing with the two dogs who had become his family. One crisp spring morning, Sarah stopped by with a camera crew. "They want to interview you," she said, grinning. "Your story's gone viral." Will groaned. "I'm not good with cameras." "You'll do fine," Sarah said, patting his shoulder. The interview aired later that week, drawing attention to the plight of rescue animals and the importance of fighting against cruelty. Messages of support poured in from across the country, with many people offering to adopt other animals rescued from the operation. As the sun set on another day, Will sat on the porch with Buck and Daisy at his feet. The forest was alive with the sounds of spring, a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined his life. "You two saved me. You know that," he said, scratching behind Buck's ears. Daisy wagged her tail, resting her head on Will's knee. For the first time in years, Will felt whole. Spring transformed the forest surrounding Will's cabin into a place of quiet beauty. The snow had long since melted, replaced by fresh green leaves and blooming wildflowers. Birds sang from the treetops, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. For Will, the changing season mirrored the shifts in his own life. The man who had once been consumed by grief and solitude now found himself surrounded by companionship and purpose. Each morning, Will woke to the sound of Daisy's soft barks and the weight of Buck's head resting against his bed. Together, they would step onto the porch, the cool morning air filling their lungs as the world slowly stirred to life. Breakfast became a shared ritual. Daisy would sit by Will's chair, her eyes wide with anticipation, while Buck stayed a respectful distance, though his tail wagged hopefully. "You two are spoiled," Will would joke, sliding a small piece of toast toward Daisy. After breakfast, they ventured into the forest. Will often carried a sketchpad and pencil, capturing the serenity of the landscape while Buck and Daisy explored nearby. It was during these quiet moments that Will felt most at peace, the weight of his past lifted by the presence of his two loyal companions. The story of Will, Buck, and Daisy had spread far beyond the small town. Letters and packages arrived weekly, many from strangers touched by their journey. Some sent treats for the dogs, while others wrote about their own rescued pets. One day, Sarah arrived with a surprise: a group of children from the local elementary school. They had heard about Will's story and wanted to meet the famous Buck and Daisy. The children crowded around the two dogs, laughing as Daisy wagged her tail excitedly and Buck patiently endured their eager hands. "Mr. Garrett," one of the children asked, her voice shy, "are Buck and Daisy heroes?" Will chuckled, glancing down at the dogs. "They sure are. They saved me just as much as I saved them." The children's teacher smiled warmly. "Your story has inspired so many of us. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope." As Buck grew stronger, his protective instincts never wavered. He patrolled the cabin's perimeter each evening, his sharp eyes scanning the woods for any sign of danger. Daisy often trailed behind him, her playful energy balanced by his steady calm. One afternoon, while chopping wood, Will heard Buck bark sharply. He turned to see the shepherd standing near the edge of the clearing, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Will called. Setting down the axe, Buck didn't move, his golden eyes fixed on a cluster of trees. Will walked over, Daisy trotting at his side, peering into the woods. Will spotted a small deer tangled in a patch of thorny vines. Its legs kicked weakly, its cries soft but desperate. "Well, look at that," Will muttered, crouching beside Buck. With care, he approached the deer, speaking in low, soothing tones. It struggled at first but soon calmed as Will gently worked to free its legs. Once the deer was free, it bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Will turned to Buck, who wagged his tail as if satisfied with the outcome. "Good call," Will said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "You're always watching out for everyone." "Ha!" One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Will sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Buck lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, while Daisy curled up on Will's lap, her soft snores breaking the silence. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Will gazed out at the fading light, his thoughts drifting to the past. For so long, he had been trapped by his grief, the memories of his wife and daughter haunting every corner of his mind. He had built walls around himself, believing that isolation was the only way to survive the pain. But Buck and Daisy had broken through those walls. Their trust, loyalty, and resilience had reminded him of the simple joys of connection and the healing power of love. "You too," he said softly, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You gave me a second chance." Buck's tail thumped against the porch, a quiet acknowledgement of Will's words. As the days turned into weeks, Will found himself drawn to the idea of helping others like Buck and Daisy. He reached out to local animal shelters, offering his skills as a carpenter to build kennels and repair facilities. Sarah helped him organize a fundraiser in the town square, where he shared his story with the community. Buck and Daisy were the stars of the event, their calm demeanor and playful energy winning the hearts of everyone they met. The fundraiser was a success, raising enough money to support the shelter for months. Will felt a sense of pride and fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. "This is just the beginning," he told Sarah as they packed up after the event. She smiled. "I think you're right." One crisp autumn morning, Will received a letter from a family interested in adopting one of the dogs rescued from the Wilson property. The letter described their excitement about giving a dog a new home and how Will's story had inspired them. Will read the letter aloud to Buck and Daisy as they sat by the fire. "Looks like your story's making a difference," he said, scratching Buck's ears. "Who'd have thought?" Daisy barked softly, wagging her tail as if in agreement. For Will, the journey wasn't just about rescuing two dogs. It was about rediscovering himself. Buck and Daisy had taught him that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was always a way forward. As the seasons changed once more, the cabin remained a sanctuary of warmth and love. Will sat on the porch with Buck and Daisy at his side, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a soft glow over the forest. "You know," Will said, glancing at the dogs, "I never thought life could feel this good again." Buck rested his head on Will's knee, his eyes closing in contentment. Daisy snuggled closer, her soft fur warm against Will's hand. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the woods and the unspoken bond between man and dog, Will knew that he had found something truly special. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and would smoke as Will prepared for another day. The cabin, once a lonely refuge, was now a place filled with life and purpose. The walls were adorned with photographs of Buck and Daisy, alongside letters and drawings sent by children and families inspired by their story. After the fundraiser, Will had stayed involved with the local animal shelter, building new kennels, repairing old ones, and even helping with adoptions. Buck and Daisy often accompanied him, their presence a calming influence on the more anxious animals. One afternoon, a young couple arrived at the shelter, holding the hand of their little boy. The child's eyes lit up when he saw Buck and Daisy, and he rushed over to pet them. "They're the dogs from the story," he exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder. Will smiled, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. That's right. Buck and Daisy have been through a lot, but they're pretty amazing, aren't they? The boy nodded eagerly. I want to adopt a dog just like them. The couple exchanged a smile with Will, their gratitude evident. Your story really touched us, the father said. It reminded us of the importance of giving second chances, not just to animals, but to ourselves too. Will's chest tightened with emotion. I think you'll find the perfect match here, he said, gesturing toward the kennels. Later that evening, Will sat by the fire, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Buck lay at his feet, while Daisy curled up beside him, her soft snores filling the room. His thoughts drifted to the letter he had received earlier that day, a note from the family who had adopted one of the rescued dogs. Thank you for bringing her into our lives. The letter read, She's not just a pet. She's part of our family now. Your courage gave her, and us, a new beginning. Will set the letter down, his eyes misting. He looked at Buck and Daisy, his voice soft. You two started all of this. Because of you, so many others are getting the second chance they deserve. Buck's tail thumped against the floor, his golden eyes warm and knowing. Not all reminders of the past were welcome. One crisp morning, a police officer arrived at the cabin with news that the man responsible for the dogfighting ring had been sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He won't be hurting anyone else, the officer assured Will. Will nodded, his expression hard. Good, it's about time. As the officer drove away, Buck stood on the porch, watching the truck until it disappeared down the road. Daisy sat beside him, her small body pressed against his side. You two don't have to worry anymore, Will said, stepping out to join them. It's over. Months passed, and winter returned to the forest. This time, the snow didn't bring the same sense of isolation it once had. Instead, it felt like a blanket of peace, covering the world in quiet beauty. One snowy evening, Sarah arrived at the cabin with a small, shivering puppy in her arms. Found this little guy by the side of the road, she said, handing the puppy to Will. The puppy, a scruffy mix with floppy ears and wide, curious eyes, yipped softly as Will wrapped it in a warm towel. Well, looks like we've got another guest, he said, glancing at Buck and Daisy. Buck sniffed the puppy, his tail wagging slightly, while Daisy nuzzled it gently. Welcome to the family, Will said with a smile. As the seasons turned once more, the cabin became a hub of activity. Families and children often visited, bringing gifts and spending time with the dogs. Will even started a small woodworking workshop, teaching locals how to craft simple furniture and donate proceeds to animal rescue efforts. One day, while working on a new project, Will paused to watch Buck and Daisy playing in the yard with the now-grown puppy. Their laughter, the joyous barks and playful yips, was a sound he never thought he'd hear in his life again. You've given me everything, he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude. On a warm spring evening, Will sat on the porch, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows over the forest. Buck rested his head on Will's lap, while Daisy lay curled up beside him, the puppy snoozing peacefully at their feet. The world felt alive with possibility, each moment a reminder of how far they had come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Will took a deep breath, the scent of pine and earth filling his lungs. Even in the darkest times, he said softly, there's always a way forward. Buck's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, his tail wagging faintly. Daisy shifted, resting her head against Will's side, her soft warmth grounding him in the present. In that moment, surrounded by love and the quiet beauty of the woods, Will knew he had found his place in the world. Years later, a small plaque was placed at the entrance to the local animal shelter. It read, "In honor of Buck and Daisy, a legacy of resilience, loyalty, and love." Beneath the words was a simple inscription. No matter how broken we feel, there's always a second chance waiting for us.